All right, we've got an episode today that is going to take us in a deep dive into an unusual niche of music and religion and the combination of how'd you find this one, Craig?
Well, it concerns what they call sacred steel. And I got interested in it, and I'll tell you that in a little bit. But a friend of mine knew I'm interested in music and had gotten interested in gospel music, and sent me a copy of one of the books that our guest today wrote called "Can't Nobody Do Me Like Jesus." Photographs from the Sacred Steel community. And the more I investigated, I realized this guy is not just a chronicler of the Sacred Steel community, but actually was instrumental in exposing it to the whole world. Yeah. And so that's why I thought we got to talk to this guy.
Right. Robert Stone is a folklorist who worked for the state of Florida, a musician as well. This all began with a folklore-inspired album, Sacred Steel, traditional African-American steel guitar music in Florida. And that's our subject today.
Bob, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I think it would be helpful if you tell people what sacred steel is, just to give them an idea of what we're talking about first.
Okay, sacred steel, as it's known today, is based on the steel guitar sacred music traditions of the House of God, Keith Dominion, and the Church of the Living God, Jewel Dominion, which are two related African-American Pentecostal churches that are found in about 26 states. And Florida is, I think, between Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia, we probably have more than half the churches. Florida figures very importantly today still in a number of churches, and also historically. And I'll be getting into that, I guess, and shaping the tradition.
And it's pedal steel or lap steel, like you'd find in like a country western band, but used for gospel, right?
What I'd like to do is, I found that I have to do this, clarify just what a steel guitar is, and then we'll talk lap and pedal steels. The steel guitar takes its name from the bar, which is usually steel, held in a right-handed player's left hand. And the instrument sits in the horizontal plane, as opposed to a guitar, the strings are in a vertical plane. And usually it's played with finger picks, doesn't have to, but that bar that I just described is the steel in steel guitar. Doesn't matter what the instrument's made out of, those shiny, chrome-looking, nickel-plated National Resonator instruments, they can be fretted, so they're not really steel guitars. A steel guitar has no frets. The strings are very high off what's still called the fretboard, but those frets on most steel guitars are just position markers, effectors, often stenciled in, anodized aluminum or something. Now, for instance, a dobro, which is commonly heard in bluegrass, is a form of an acoustic steel guitar, usually. That said, to add to the confusion, the Dobro company has always made those resonator guitars with the hubcap in the face, as they say, fretted instruments. And they're still made as fretted instruments or played like an acoustic steel guitar. Well, what differs about the pedal steel guitar is that for musical reasons, virtually all steel guitars are in an open chord tuning. It may be a rather complicated chord, like a C13th or something like that. So what you can harmonize, that is by playing two or three strings at a time, is limited by that tuning. The pedal steel overcame those limitations by a system of pedals, and what's usually not even talked about or known by most people is the knee levers. Sometimes they have more knee levers than pedals, but they all do the same thing. They either raise or lower the pitch of one or more strings at a time. You press the first pedal and it raises the pitch of a certain string. And the modern instruments are totally programmable, so you can tune the thing to anything you want to, and then program those pedals and knee levers and you might see a total of 10 pedals and knee levers on a single neck, on a 10-string neck. So it can get pretty complicated. Funny thing is, when you're watching someone play one of those, you don't see all that stuff that's going on down below. They might be just holding the bar in one spot, but they're moving and their knees. So that's the difference. The common parlance is, if it doesn't have pedals, it's called a lap steel, even if it's on legs.
Gotcha.
Even if it has 3 or 4 necks and it's way too heavy to put on your lap and has to be on legs, it's still not by everybody, but the common parlance is you call it lap steel. And, musicians will say, do you play lap or you play pedals?
Now, you first saw, I was reading, you first saw this in 1992. Can you tell us that story and how you reacted when you first heard it?
I had hired on with the Florida Folk Life program in 1990. And I live in Gainesville then and still. The program at that time, I commuted to White Springs every day. Every day of the week, where the Florida Folk Festival's been held for 70 years or something now, since 1952 or 53. I had a friend, a musician friend. I'm also an amateur musician. I was a fiddler at the time. He was partners in a store called the Banjo Shop in Hollywood. I had moved up. I lived in South Dade. I had moved up to Gainesville. So I kept in touch with Mike all the time. And their store was a happening place. Musicians, Bolivian charango players that come in, Yugoslavian fiddlers, you name it. It was a store that musicians came to from miles around. And I talked to him nearly every day, and he started recording these African-American men that came in and played lap steel. And of course, it was kind of distorted. Mind you, this is 1992. It was distorted. Telephone fidelity isn't great. It really wasn't great back then. Sometimes it sounded more like blues harp than steel guitar. And it's, of course, very African-American, very, very bluesy. And I didn't even have to tell Mike. He started getting me connections, contact data, because he was used to doing that. We were on the same wavelength. And he was sort of my eyes and ears for music in that end of the state, because, as you can imagine, here we are up in little old White Springs, near the Georgia line, trying to cover the whole state. So we needed all the eyes and ears we could get. And right away, he'd get somebody's contact information, and they'd say, "Well, I'm not very good. You need to hear." The 2 names that came up right away were Aubrey Gent and Glenn Lee. And it wasn't too long after that Glenn Lee blew up his amplifier. And they were a PV dealer. So he came all the way up from Perrine, which is way down south, near Homestead, and came all the way up to Hollywood to get his PV amp fixed. And also one of the partners in the store, there were Mike and two brothers, was a dobro player. So he had sort of a casual interest in electric lap steel. And so he had a few in the store. So that's one reason some of these fellas would drop in, because even to this day, you're not going to walk in Guitar Center and find a steel guitar. You're not going to walk in most independent music stores, the few that are left, and find a steel guitar. It's a specialty instrument. So these guys were glad to see that. And it turns out that Broward County is, to this day, one of the strongest counties for the House of God Church.
But when you first heard it, though, what did you think about it? How did it make you feel?
Oh, it was incredible. The thing where the hair stands up on your arms and the back of your neck. It sounded very African-American. It didn't sound like country twang at all. And B, it was refreshing. And they did things that I still have yet, hear elsewhere. Like especially they do, when congregations will moan, they could do that on the bass strings. Yeah, I never heard that anywhere before or since. And so it didn't sound like Hawaiian music, which is the origins of steel guitar, and it sure didn't sound like country music. To fast forward a bit, I got permission from my boss to go down to South Florida and check it out. And the same day, I interviewed Aubrey Gent in his apartment he was sharing with the guy in Fort Pierce, and made a very quick recording. I had a brand new DAT recorder, digital audio tape recorder, and like everybody who got initiated, I overloaded it. Yeah, because you used to, with analog tape, you used to writing very high, on the maxing out the tape, although you don't want to do that on digital. And then that same night, I went to a big, must have been the South Florida Assembly in Pompano Beach at Ely High School, where there were probably 300 or 400 people. And Aubrey Gent, I remember him warning me. He said, "I hope this isn't too much for you." I'm thinking, what could be too much about a church service? But I soon found out. I mean, it was rock and roll. There were people falling out. The clapping, as loud as the band was, the clapping would sometimes drown out the band, and people shouting and dancing. And Glenn Lee played a big pedal steel, like a classic country and western double 10-string neck Evans steel. So anyhow, it was bingo, man, off the deep end. And of course, I brought samples of this back again to condense the story. I applied for a grant to the National Endowment for the Arts, Folk Arts program. Even by then, it was peanuts. It was like $6,500 or $6,400 to do a survey of the music in Florida. So went out, and that was the genesis of that first album, which we titled Sacred Steel. So the name Sacred Steel is actually coined in our office. You have to name a project something for budgeting purposes, if nothing else. Being a state, we were a bureau under the Department of State, so we were calling it Gospel Steel, just for had to call it something. We got to the point of we were ready to produce this thing, and the very first album was originally a cassette tape in a big vinyl container that looked almost like a DVD box, and because CDs were new and expensive at that time, and I said, well, I think the boss said, well, we'll call it Gospel Steel, and I said, with a subtitle, about Florida, and I said, I don't like that because gospel music, a lot of it is performance, and much of this music is really functional music, which you wouldn't hear outside the church. I said, it's functional, sacred music. He said, how about Sacred Steel? I said, hey, alliteration,
Always go with the alliterative title.
It caught on. Now it's, from pretty early on, it became when some of these musicians started performing at public festivals and so forth. It was and it still today, if you hired a Chicago blues band, you might not know anything about this particular band, but you kind of know what you're going to hear. Same with Sacred Steel. You might not know the Lee Boys or the Campbell Brothers or whatever, but if there's Sacred Steel, you know what you're going to hear more or less. You have a rough idea.
How did this unusual instrument make its way into the Pentecostal church, particularly in the Deep South?
You have to realize that there was this huge Hawaiian music fad. All steel guitar, acoustic, electric, whatever, is rooted in Hawaii. They first developed the instrument in about 1885. And in the early part of the 20th century, there was this huge Hawaiian music fad, and many of the musicians from Hawaii came to the U.S. to play. To the continental U.S., to play. There was a Panama Pacific Exposition, which in 1915, which was like a world fair. If you go back in history, there were a lot of these World's Fair types of events, and this one was in San Francisco. And I think it was actually millions of people came to that thing over a period of time. And the Hawaiian Pavilion was a real hit. And besides hula dancers and Hawaiian style singing, there were musicians playing steel guitars, which were acoustic at the time. Well, it caught on, and then it became, Tin Pan Alley picked it up, and people were writing, pseudo Hawaiian things. And there were groups touring the continental U.S. Teaching schools were developed, and then the instrument, the steel guitar, was the first electric guitar commercially made. Rickenbacker marketed theirs in 1932, I think. It immediately was just the thing the Hawaiian style players wanted, because they liked the sustain, the ability of it to sustain long notes. There were fretted electric guitars made in that period too, but they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't necessarily like it. So for quite a few years, the Hawaiian guitars outsold the fretted guitars. I mean, it's hard to imagine today, but that's how big Hawaiian music was. It was everywhere. It was like disco or something. But it endured for well into even post-World War II, And then there was this, in particular, going back to this particular tradition, there was an outfit called the Oahu Publishing Company out of Cleveland, Ohio. And as the story goes, Truman Eason, who was Willie Eason's, I'll talk about him more, Willie Eason's older brother, he was older by about 15 years, was in Philadelphia, heard this group performing on the radio and advertising steel guitar lessons. And it was associated with the Oahu Publishing Companies. They called all their little studios Honolulu Conservatory of Music. So he took lessons, and I checked it out. Was able to do some research. Took quite a while to nail it down, but all his family members remembered was that he heard a guy named Jack, and he was Hawaiian. Well, it was Jack Kahaolapua. There was Jimmy and Jack Kahaolapua that taught at the Philadelphia Honolulu Conservatory of Music, and it was within walking distance from Truman's home. So it all added up. And then to verify that, I talked to a musician who's been dead for a few years now, but Ralph Colciana, who took lessons from, I think, Jimmy Kahaolapua, and went on to be a career Hawaiian musician. Even played in Miami Beach for Al Capone.
Oh my! And so then they started using that in church. Is that how?
Yes, and first Truman, the older brother, played in the straight up Hawaiian manner. Just the melody, lilting, kind of schmaltzy, playing straight hymns. But Willie, being unschooled, he combined, the Pentecostal sensibility, the idea of imitating the human voice, and with some rhythm, and also incorporating elements of his brother's style. It was the old story where when Big Brother wasn't home, Willie would sneak over and play his instrument, and eventually he got to be a bigger hit than his brother. His brother died young. I mean, he was born in 1905 and died in 1949. Willie was born in 21, so there was a 16-year difference. Willie could never tell me for sure how many kids there was in the family. They started Willie was born in Lickskillet, Georgia, which is a community in Schley County, Schley, which isn't too far from Plains, where Jimmy Carter comes from, over that way.
And then it spread through the South. Is that how?
Well, Willie got involved. At first, his brother Truman did. There was a fellow named Bishop J.R. Lockley, who was headquartered out of either New York or Philadelphia, and he had a group that he called the Gospel Feast Party. And he would, especially in the winter, he would take this group all the way down as far south as Miami. And he was a bishop in the church, so he was over several churches on the East Coast, and they called it the Gospel Feast Party, and it was musicians, of course, preachers, and they'd perform in churches as well as on sometimes do street corner ministries. And Truman dropped out right away. In those days, they didn't pay the musicians anything. And Lockley saw what a hit that, what a charismatic person Willie was. So he invited Willie to go, and his mother took him out of high school and withdrew him from high school in 1939, I think it was. I found those records. And kind of the rest is history, but Willie played with the Gospel Feast Party for just a little while, just a year or two, I don't know. But he dropped out because he wasn't getting paid. He was just getting fed was about it. So Willie's was always a great entrepreneur, even as a young man. I mean, he's, 18, 19 years old. He went out on his own, busking on street corners, playing as a guest musician. He was a very good singer, which is a talent his brother Truman didn't have. Willie was a very engaging person. If you ever met him, you'd never forget him. He was really quite a guy. Plus, he could cook, he could play the piano, he could fix cars. He later became a gospel music promoter. He promoted gospel programs with the stars of the day all over, even in Philadelphia, where he was based. He had the Metropolitan Opera House. But he traveled to Florida a lot, especially during the winter, and it was there in Ocala where Henry Nelson heard him. Henry Nelson was about 10 years younger than Willie. So he was just like a 10-year-old guy. He heard Willie, and he said, I wanted to do everything I saw. He was just terrific, And, this was back in the days when there was just one electrical outlet in the middle of the church. One
Yeah.
Willie didn't really teach Henry anything, but, in the typical sort of folk tradition, he just observed and listened and went home and worked out. And because Henry Nelson's father was a higher up man in the church, he was a bishop. He was in charge of churches all the way from down in Key West to up in Tennessee. So he traveled a lot with his father and became really, even though Willie was the inspiration and kind of at the root of it in the house of the God anyhow, Henry Nelson became the most influential in the church because he played in the church for years. Where Willie was essentially kicked out of the church early on because they put restrictions on him because the church, some of the people in the national leadership, and it's a conflict that continues today. They didn't like the fact that he was, like a bigger deal than the pastor.
Oh yeah.
I've talked to people that have done research in mega churches, out in Los Angeles, where they have congregations of 20,000 or something. Well, there it's the same problem, except they have like these gospel mega stars, they're making. They're musicians, and of course, they're very powerful cultural figures. But in the end, the clergy has to be in charge of the church. So it's a struggle. It goes, in this case, all the way back to the 30s. But that said, there were always local ministers that wanted to have Willie play at their church, maybe unbeknownst to the headquarters in Nashville, Tennessee, because he was a draw,
Yeah.
And, when it would come time to take up the collection or just to have more people in the church and save souls, Willie was a draw. He was a very, very, I can't emphasize how charismatic he was. He was a very good singer. And he was the only one who recorded for national gospel record labels. He recorded for Aladdin, even King Records out of Cincinnati. He recorded everyone from Grandpa Jones to James Brown. They established a label called Queen for a couple of years. They thought it would expand their marketing. Turned out it kind of backfired. So Willie recorded a couple sides, but I think in total he recorded 14 sides.
Wow.
Yeah, I think all of them were in the early 50s.
How did Aubrey Gent? Is it Gent or Jen? I'm think
It's
I've been saying
pronounced gent. It's pronounced gent, like ladies and gents.
How did he get into
Well,
it?
his father was Henry Nelson. His parents got divorced early on. So you have this progression. Willie Easton, who was 10 years older than Henry, he inspired Henry. Then Aubrey was inspired by his father. And Aubrey has a son named A.J. Gent, who's a big, pretty successful pop and R&B singer. And he plays a lap steel hanging from a strap. He's really a consummate. He's really good, and he's a good singer. And I think his sister was performing with him for a while. I haven't kept up. So here you have, 3.5 generations, you could say, of this one family. So that's a good example of how it can work.
Yeah. You mentioned that this was functional music, unlike gospel, which I guess was on the radio and had kind of a popular moment in time. Okay, what do you mean by functional music?
Well, first of all, some people would differ with me, and they would call anything played in church gospel music. But for instance, when they do this, and they do them for extended periods, these praise breaks or praise music, it's up-tempo instrumental music. Drives, some of it doesn't even have any chord changes. In fact, that's a characteristic of the House of God Keep Dominion, is their praise music generally doesn't have any chord changes. If you ever heard the Blind Boys of Alabama, where they'll sing a song and then they'll get it going, and they'll get into what they call a drive section, where it's just, hey, Jesus, what do you say? Just on and on and on, and maybe repetitious, but the music's not changing. Well, they do that instrumentally, and that's frankly, that's the thing that can really, really move the congregation into dancing and what's called shouting, which is not necessarily a vocal thing. It's whole body movements. Now in the Jewel Dominion, which I haven't talked about much yet, they play at a slower tempo, and their praise music almost always has typical 3 chords like you'd find in blues. 1, 4, 5 progression, a more moderate tempo. And they say we can dance a lot longer than the House of God. They don't wear themselves out, And also, and generally in the Jewel Dominion, they never play percussive chords like they do in the House of God Keith Dominion. They pluck their strings more like you'd hear, say, in country music. Now, what's interesting is that there was a fellow named Lorenzo Harrison who also lived in Ocala. So here you have Henry Nelson living in Ocala, 10 years old. Willie Easton comes through on his way, touring the Eastern Seaboard, playing music on street corners and churches, wherever. So he influences Henry. Then there was this fellow, Bishop Jewell of the House Church of the Living God, Jewel Dominion, had a church in Ocala, and that's where Lorenzo Harrison lived. And he was just a teenager, and he joined up with Bishop Jewell, and he could barely play at the time, but he was inspired by Willie. It's not like Willie taught him anything, but he heard Willie acknowledge that. And I spoke to his first wife, who's since deceased, and she verified all that. So Ocala was a real intersection of all this music, and the Jewel Dominion, they're big in Detroit, in the Ohio, Mississippi, and the Keith Dominion is pretty much, it's more along the House of God Keith Dominion is more along the Eastern Seaboard, but also there's churches in Texas. I think one in LA. They have missions in Africa, in Haiti, in the Bahamas. I know Glenn Lee used to go to the Bahamas to play because they didn't have any steel players there, and he was located in Perrine, in South Dade County.
I know, and this happens a lot with gospel performers, like say Sam Cooke, where they make a big mark in gospel, but then they feel compelled to go secular and turn into big stars that way. Has that happened with Sacred Steel folks?
There's almost invariably that struggle and conflict of gospel secular. Willie Eason was successful. He was a good singer, besides a good instrumentalist. And he said that Savoy Records, in particular, out of New York City, wanted him to do, rhythm and blues. And he told me, all they said, instead of saying Jesus, you just say baby.
I love you, Jesus. I love you, baby. That makes sense.
By the way, he knew Sam Cooke.
Oh boy.
Yeah, Willie lived in Chicago for a long time. He was incredible. He owned his first house when he was like 21 years old. He owned a house in Philadelphia, which he, by the way, rented out to the Consolers. There was an old gospel duo from Miami.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so Sullivan and Iola Pugh, he had at his zenith, I think he had about 100 apartment units in New York and New Jersey. And he retired to St. Pete, which is where I finally met up with him. And he opened a restaurant. He had several takeout restaurants in New York and New Jersey. They were all called Fat Willie from Philly. and he when he moved to St. Pete, he opened one and it flopped big time. Then he apparently also made a bad investment in a motel or something. But I'll never forget when I first found him and went to visit him. Not sure when that was, probably maybe 1993 or 4. I don't know, but I thought I was in the wrong neighborhood. When you hear about a black gospel musician who made his way, playing on street corners. Yeah, here he was in St. Pete by the foot of that big bridge, and pretty nice neighborhood. I'm thinking, whoa. Well, it turned out he was a lot wealthier and well-to-do than that. He had speedboats and everything when he was up in New Jersey.
Now, you organized the first, or helped organize the first national convention of this in 2000. Was that?
Well, the church has its own general assembly, what they call, every year. Yes, but I helped with the first thing that became known as the Sacred Steel Convention, and it was actually at Rollins College. It was ostensibly organized by a guy from the church who's died young since. He needed help. He didn't know about organizing, so I hooked him up with Matt, somebody there, and who was part of a group called the Friendly Five, I think, and they organized public events and things in that area, and they got the auditorium at Rollins College, so it was really nice, and we stayed. All the musicians and others stayed in this historic hotel, which I think was raised the very next year. It was really pretty cool. And Chris Strockwitz came out from California, and see, by then the Florida Folk Life program was relocated to Tallahassee and downsized in 1995, end of 1995, and that's just when our cassette album came with the 32-page booklet came out. Mm-hmm. So I pitched it, and I knew that the state of Florida isn't Cracker Jack at distributing sound recordings. So,
you don't say.
So I pitched it to Our Holy Records, and that was the memorable moment. Chris Strockwitz called me one day between Christmas and New Year's, and he said, "I'm calling about this fantastic recording that you sent me." And that was it. From then on, he of course, by then I had quit working for the Folk Life program because I didn't want to relocate to Tallahassee, and later went on contract working for them again, but I was never again a state employee. And I told him, I said, you have to be patient. It might take you 6 months to work out a contract with the state. That's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. Dogs turn slowly. And it took almost exactly that. I had one of my colleagues that was still with the program She shepherded it through, and it got done. And then one day, Chris called me and said, "This is great. I want to do 2 or 3 more albums. Do some studio albums." And I said, "Well," I thought about it, and then I said 3, and here's who they should be: Sonny Treadway, Aubrey Gent, which were both from Florida. Sonny from Deerfield Beach, Aubrey from Fort Pierce, and then the Campbell brothers from Rochester, New York. I had heard them, so we did them right here in Gainesville. We recorded 3 albums in 2 days.
Wow!
and then mixed a couple of them, mixed 2 of the 3, and then went down to Chris had said he wanted to do a doc video also. That was done under the Arhoolie Foundation. So we traveled down south to Glen Lee's church. And, then after Chris was gone, I remixed the 3rd album, which was Aubrey Gent's album. I did that in his absence, of course, with the help of the engineer there at the studio. But
how prevalent is the instrument today in the Pentecostal church in South Florida?
Well, first of all, it's these 2 specific organizations: the House of God, Keep Dominion, and the Church of the Living God, Jewel Dominion. And those are the shortened names. They're very long names. That's one thing fascinating about this. They are, to this day, the only churches I know of, and believe me, I've dug into it, where the steel guitar is at the top of the instrument hierarchy. No other instrument ever plays the lead part. The steel guitarist is like the band leader. He's not up there conducting or anything, but they take all their cues from him. It's usually bass and drums. And in the House of God, you're likely to see a synth keyboard too. Not so much in the Jewel Dominion, but it's huge. And of course, the success of these records and people like the Campbell brothers, and I'm sure more significantly, Robert Randolph, came out of all this, and he's had in fact, he was picked up, didn't sign immediately, but after that first Sacred Steel convention, it was just a matter of a year, or I don't know if it was more than a year, that he got signed by Warner Brothers, and he's been with them ever since. The names of the record labels have changed, but they're all under Warner Brothers as far as I know. And he's got a big contract, and he's been very influential nationally. The young guys in these churches want to be like Robert Randolph. Sure. Of course, there's only 1 or 2 people at the very top, right? Yeah. So your odds are really slim, and you have to really have it together and be totally dedicated. And I remember Robert from the beginning, he really didn't want to, he wasn't looking to do a record with Arhoolie. He says, "No, I got bigger plans." And he was a single young man at the time, and says, "I'm putting the girls to the side." He says, he played guitar for hours and hours and hours every day. He wanted to really, he came from a very musical family, and some of them were professional musicians who had recorded, and so he was, had that focus, and achieved his goals.
Where do you see the music going in the future?
It's just so hard to say. I mean, I've seen Aubrey Gent's son go really commercial sort of R&B. He's a good singer. You can look him up on YouTube. AJ Gent, he's really something. Robert Randolph hasn't really sorted it out. There's room for different routes. Like the Campbell brothers have pretty much stayed with the cultural circuit. They perform at college arts programs, series, concerts. Mm-hmm. They performed at the World Sacred Music Festival in Fez, Morocco. They performed for toward China under the U.S. Department of State. I mean, they're the big ambassadors. Mm-hmm. Then the Lee Boys, they're more appeal to the jam band crowd and the very excitable music. She's one of the guys in North Carolina, whose name I'm of course blanking on. He even recently recorded an album with an African hand drummer and a celebrity bassist. So there's a lot of room. So I think it's going to continue to develop. One thing that's really good now is that the new national leader of the House of God Church is a musician himself.
Oh.
He was a distinguished drum major and an academic scholar. Prior to his ecclesiastical calling, he was an international recording artist and world-renowned musician, performing with award-winning artists such as Wilson Pickett, Bobby Bird, Etta James, and many others. So, I mean, he's the first one I've ever seen that used this term sacred steel on their website and in a prideful way. His predecessor was not he always thought that the musicians were having too much power. Again, it goes back to that struggle between the musicians and clergy. And, you know, in the end, in a church service, it's not about the music, it's about the church service and what's going on there. And, you know, I've had some Elton Noble, who's a steel player and a pastor in Fort Pierce. I've known him since the beginning. Matter of fact, he was Aubrey Gent's apprentice. So I've known him since 1992, I guess. And he's very good at expressing, you know, in the end, it's not about the musician. The musician has to keep that in mind. It's about the service and the people that are hurting. And, you know, these services are typically 2 hours or longer, and they're very cathartic, very emotional. You know, it's not like going to your average Presbyterian church.
I hear you.
Robert Stone, folklorist and musician who brought sacred steel to a wider audience outside of the church. Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us today.
My pleasure.
What a fascinating musical and religious subculture there with a heavy presence in Florida.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I first heard he mentioned Robert Randolph there. Dan, I first heard Robert Randolph stuff, and I said, "Wow, that's amazing. Where did this come from?" You know, surely he didn't invent it. And then I discovered there was a huge Florida connection. So I said, we got to talk about that on the podcast.
Yeah, it'll go well with episodes from the archives: Elvis in Florida, Beatles in Florida, Tom Petty, Allman Brothers, Southern Rock, R
Jimmy
and
Buffett.
B, Jimmy Buffett, of course. Welcome to Florida.
Welcome to Florida.